in a street that our car had just passed was a huge explosion. It might have been 150 meters behind our vehicle. It was massive. Reality was setting in, and the concept of bravado and fun and games and heroism was fading. I wanted to be at the forefront of the risk and the opportunity as well to kill Taliban. The night before my first foot patrol, I don't think I slept. It was a scary thing. We started our patrol in the darkness of the morning at 4 o'clock. Well, I can understand why I had so many difficulties with the clinical psychological process. The Taliban had seen where our team was, and they knew that basically G'day and welcome to today's podcast, inviting you in. I am Australian Viking Lex D Reilly. In today's episode, I will be inviting you into the Afghan files, Pandora's box. So this podcast will probably be very uncomfortable for the both of us. I have been feeling in my body the last hours the discomfort of the topic, and I will be sharing my personal experiences from Afghanistan and some of the experiences of my peers that are relative to my experience in the war on terror. The invitation here is individual experiences of listening to this podcast may vary. And it's important to have an element of viewer discretion advised, because I will be sharing some very uncomfortable, graphic, catastrophic, horrific scenes and experiences. It can really bring up a lot within the listener, and it's totally okay to not progress on this podcast, and it's also okay at any point in time to eject from this. There will be some very heavy concepts, and I just want you to check in with yourself if you are able to, whether you are a veteran or not, or whatever your personal story is, if you're able to honor your sensitivity and honor your own needs. And if you are not able to remain in positive control of your stress levels, your arousal symptoms, your central nervous system, this is probably going to be too much for you. So I would really just invite you to check in with yourself if this is something that you are ready to listen to, and that if it brings some things up for you, that is totally your jurisdiction, and I can take zero responsibility other than being the bearer of truth as best as I can. However, I am not going to expect myself to be communicating particularly well in this podcast. My experiences of Afghanistan were when I was a young man, and my language and perspective of the world was very different then. So as I reconnect with those past experiences, I don't expect myself to be articulating particularly well. So for me, some of these memories are in Pandora's box in a way, and I'm not shy to open Pandora's box. I feel inspired to meet and accept all of myself, regardless of how uncomfortable that can be. But I know for me, at other stages in my life, in and after Afghanistan, I would rather bury how I felt, and I would rather bury and avoid particular memories. And as I progress with the podcast, I think I will remind myself, but also to share with the listener, of, let's say, the shortfalls of clinical psychology for being able to repair, mend, and heal and grow from such experiences. The idea of sitting in a fluorescent room for 60 minutes and talking about something so catastrophic or confronting, and then being released to society straight after that session. Well, I can understand why I had so many difficulties with the clinical psychological process, and why the greatest healing for me has been deep within nature, and also under the guidance of plant medicines, and with healers of a more varied and experienced skill. So the lead up to Afghanistan was quite intense, and that was maybe 4 to 6 months, a year was away in the bush. And I will fast track a bit of the timeline, but I'll paint a bit of a picture. I had been in the battalion, the infantry battalion, for maybe 2 to 3 years, and then there was an understanding that our unit was going to go to war, and that our unit would be encompassing the operational responsibility of the task force, and that it was quite likely that everyone in the unit that was willing and able would go to Afghanistan. And our training steered away from the more generic concepts of warfare and started to steer more into the skills for the Middle Eastern theatre of war and the skills required for a counterinsurgency war. And that is quite different from conventional warfare, although there is a lot of skills which can be copied and pasted between the two styles of war. A war against insurgents, so a counterinsurgency war, is there is a lot less of a clear line for where the enemy can be identified, and the enemy is for the most part unidentifiable, as they're not wearing uniforms, and they are, well, it's harder to know who to fight, and it's harder to know who the enemy is until they are revealing themselves. So some of the preparation that we were having in training for war was to be developing quite a deep familiarity within our teams, but also to be having exposure to environments which could be similar in intensity and stress, and, let's say, operational and tactical considerations to what we would be looking at in Afghanistan. Some really confronting part of that education was being taught what different bullet wounds look like, and that was when I suppose things started to get quite more real, was the more in-depth understanding of the weapon systems that were used by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and, for example, the specific impact of a bullet from an AK-47 on the human body compared to a 5.56, which is the size of projectile or bullet that we were using within the NATO forces. And seeing photos of what happens to the human body when it is shot by those different calibers of weapons was sickening in my stomach. And there was certainly fear with that, but also an understanding that I was going to go to Afghanistan, and I wasn't going to let anything in the way of that. I had a deep calling to go, but the more I was gaining education, the more the reality was setting in, and the concept of bravado and fun and games and heroism was fading. Although that was still certainly there. Also, gaining an understanding of the specific weapons within that area of operations, and how the Taliban had been using implemented explosive devices, IEDs, or they were often referred to on the news, on the television, as mines or roadside bombs. and understanding, for example, how those systems work, how a bomb specifically works, and the ways in which the Taliban were utilizing the bombs to try to kill us. And that was the whole reality of that process, was understanding the tools of the trade, so to speak, and then also knowing that we are going to a theater of war, and this is specifically what is happening currently in that theater. So that might have been 4, 6, 8 months before we were going. We were starting to get information from on the ground to get an accurate picture so we can tailor our training, so we were as best prepared as we could be. Although, yeah, oof, I suppose one can only be so prepared until it is game day. So I had said goodbye to my family, and that was my mother and father, and my brother and my grandparents, and also my wife at the time, and my first family is how I refer to it. My wife and my first children. And so we said goodbye, and that was difficult. But I felt like I was pretty good at stuffing down my emotions at that point in time and wearing a mask of bravado. And although it was still very sad to say goodbye to my children and to my wife at the time, and we arrived some days later in Afghanistan, and we were conducting training within the base. And that was to expose us to moving in small teams in the actual environment, what the real buildings looked like, how it was to breathe in the air, how the temperature was, those kind of things. I'm sure that you have taken a flight from your home city or town or whatever and gotten off the airport in another country, and it feels very different when you leave the air conditioning of the airplane or the airport, and then you are smelling the potentially very new smells. You're feeling the humidity change, the atmosphere, however it is for you when you've traveled to maybe a developing country or a third world place, or even just a foreign country. It can be just a different climate, and it feels quite sensorily different. Going to Afghanistan was far more different than I could have imagined. And so we were acclimatizing. During the acclimatization period, we were conducting room clearances as teams and going through drills in an urban environment with buildings. And they stopped the exercise to pass on to us some live information about an incident which had literally just occurred. There was an incident from recollection in the Mirabad Valley where an engineer was clearing an IED, a roadside bomb. The team had come across that, and it was his job to clear the mine. And he had the bomb detonate in his face, and it lacerated and took off. I don't know exactly what happened, but the blast had scarred his face, and he was blind in one eye immediately and for the rest of his life. And what was passed on to us by the men conducting the training who knew this man personally was that he was just, he was happy that he had one eye left to look at his daughter when he got home. Being passed on that news, knowing that we're in Afghanistan, it's maybe day 2 and we're conducting training to acclimatize to the area, and this is what's just happened, and this is like maybe the second last day of this man's 6-month, 8-month rotation. That was very confronting. And again, I felt in my body how uncomfortable that was, and also how scary that was. An immediate reminder that this is a war zone and I may never see my children again, or I may actually be in a situation where I'm happy I have one eye. That was So I suppose what I did with my fear and concerns there was I felt like a tension in my throat, and I stuffed down the uncomfortable feelings in my body and never spoke about that during the trip, I believe. So we proceeded with our training, and then it was time to go out on our first vehicle patrol. So this main base that we were in was quite large. Its span was potentially kilometers at a guess, and it had multiple nations. It had an airfield. It had a lot of logistical elements there. And our first patrol out of that base was a vehicle convoy where we were going to be a part of a resupply, I believe, to the Mirabad Valley. And that looked like several hours in a vehicle convoy. The duration can always change based on incidents. You can imagine if vehicles get blown up or ambushed, that changes what we expect. Then we focus on that situation. But the concept was several hour convoy out to the Mirabad Valley, and we would sleep as a team next to our vehicles, and we would then be heading back to the main base at Tarankout the next day. And that was exciting. It was definitely invigorating to go out in so many vehicles at a guess, 20 vehicles, and it was a very powerful entourage to be a part of. As we were leaving the base in Tarankout, we were winding through the streets of the township of Tarankout. And that was really so foreign and so confronting to see just how life was in that sprawl, and what the different building materials were made of, what the cars were that were preferred in that region. It was in February, so it was very wintry still, and just seeing what they are wearing, how they manage riding motorcycles in those temperatures. It was a lot of new sensory stuff to take in. And we were driving through quite a busy area with cars and buildings, and it's referred to as complex terrain. The urban environment is quite a complex environment. Maybe 10 minutes out of the gate of Tarankout, in a street that our car had just passed, was a huge explosion. It might have been 150 meters behind our vehicle. It was massive, and it shook. It shook. It shook the cars. It shook the people. It was a big explosion, and I could see the big dust cloud riding up, and I was outside of the hatch of the vehicle. I almost always positioned myself outside the hatch of the vehicle on the patrols. I wanted to be at the forefront of the risk and the opportunity as well to kill Taliban or to relay information. I wanted to be as much a part of the action as I could be. And so I saw that explosion, and that was in one street away from the street we just passed. And my interpretation of that was that it was an accident. They potentially prematurely detonated. They missed our team, and they blew up a street away from maybe trying to bring the bomb to us. So they probably accidentally killed himself and some civilians, and we kept on moving, which is generally a standard operating procedure during an ambush, is that you don't stay in the kill zone. None of our vehicles were affected, although it was scary as shit just to see the power of this huge bomb going up so close as well. And on the first vehicle patrol, that was scary. And again, it was another one of these situations where I don't think anyone in the team, or myself, I can speak more for myself, had the emotional intelligence to just unpack those kind of things. But I just wouldn't have spoken about that I was scared of that, even though I was. So we kept on going. It can seem quite uneventful, but that is actually a very big deal. And but in the grand scheme of those experiences, in the rest of my experience of war, it's somewhat uneventful. It's a near miss. But if that bomb was 20 meters in a different direction, it probably would have resulted in the death of members of our team. So it's easy to brush that off, but it was very serious. So after that first convoy patrol, we then went back to Taran Kowt and then moved out to our company's area of operations. And that was the valley that was going to be our home. And if you can use the word home or where we live or whatever, but that valley was our company's, our mentoring team's responsibility, and that was where we were going to reside, live, inhabit. And so we eventually progressed out there and started to get an understanding of how to really operate in that environment, what it was like in reality, making any adjustments to our equipment or standing operating procedures that we had to. But going out from the city, and then let's say, if you call it a city, but you can, and then out to somewhere more urban, more agricultural, more agricultural. This was the environment that we were living in this Chora Baluchi region. And that life out there was perhaps similar to what it was in 200 AD, right? The year 200 after Christ's death. Maybe there is some Iron Age technologies, but for the most part, the average house doesn't have electricity. Water is running in a stream through an aqueduct system, which is incredibly old and incredibly refined. It's actually very impressive. The houses were built from earth, and it really looked very much like you can imagine life in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. The area was very agricultural, like I said, and their main crops of expertise was marijuana, poppies for opium, and then the food that they relied on to live from. On my first foot patrol, the night before my first foot patrol, I don't think I slept. It was a scary thing. We started our patrol in the darkness of the morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we went out under night vision goggles. So we were going to rendezvous with a local police team before dawn. And walking out into the streets at that time, and also seeing just these unique things like the size of the Afghan fighting dogs, that was very scary. Those dogs are serious. For the most part, they cut their ears off because they had a culture of getting the dogs to fight each other as a recreation, basically for betting, I think, or for at least for men to enjoy watching. And so the dogs are very serious, they're very terrifying, and even just walking past these dogs on chains that are just absolute killing machines, and seeing their eyes when everything is green because I have the night vision goggle on, or seeing the panting breath of this massive beast of an animal when we're patrolling down the roads. And that, from a sensory perspective, it's very foreign. That first mission, that first patrol, was one of the police was an informant basically for us, but he knew where some of the Taliban were living, and he had a balaclava on. And it's the counterinsurgency makes warfare very complicated. Because there is it's a grey blend of, well, who is the enemy and who is the friend, and maybe the enemy one day is the friend next day. It's complex in the human terrain aspect of war. And the policeman had to basically conceal his identity so that none of his neighbors knew it was him who was pointing out where the Taliban were hiding the weapon. And his signal to identify to our infantry team and then our engineer team, it was maybe 15 Australians, and there could have been some Dutch. Maybe there was 4 Dutch guys, like an elite recon team, or maybe 8 of them, but it wasn't a particularly large force. But his signal was to put on his shoulder a case of ammunition. And he would put this case of ammunition on his shoulder outside a compound that he knew the Taliban either stored weapons there or the Taliban lived in that compound. And then the engineers would come and search with the mine detectors to try to pick up a metal signature to then dig. But one of the risks with digging is the ultimate question, like, is it a bomb or is it an AK-47 or an RPG? And so the engineers were quite skilled at being able to identify based off the sound what they suspected it to be, and then also based off the placement. But the Taliban were incredibly clever, and an invitation for you is to understand, like, in an environment with all of our might and all of our faculties, we are trying to kill each other. We are there to kill each other, and we're doing that to the best of our ability with everything we've got. So the Taliban and then the coalition, our forces are always thinking about how to outsmart each other, how to catch each other, how to kill each other. And that's not a common thought for someone, hopefully anyway, in daily life. But the obsession of killing and thinking and outwitting, outsmarting, and this cat and mouse game led to a lot of really clever things. And for example, the Taliban would hide their weapons next to the water in the river, in the aqueducts, and they would cover it with mud, because it was less visually visible when the water might be splashing on the side, and they would wrap the weapons in plastic and then rags and then bury them. And they would do that so it's not in their house, because then if we find it in their house, then they're identified by their house. But if they do it near their house, they have ambiguity. So as you can imagine, it is very complex. Sometimes, for example, we would patrol past an area, then the Taliban would dig up their weapon, and then they would shoot at us once we've gone past them. So we can be patrolling through an area, and they are just normal looking Pashtun, which was the tribe that we were in, the region in southern Afghanistan, and I believe a section of northern Pakistan, which is the Pashtun ethnicity, the Pashtun tribe. They were the people in our area, so they just looked like normal Pashtuns. And we walk past these people. We might even say hello to these people, and then they dig up a weapon and might shoot at us from behind, or they have an understanding. They can see where our team is walking, and then they'll try to put a bomb 500 meters in front of us and hope that by the time we get on to where they are, they have finished planting the bomb and they can move, and then we walk onto the bomb. So that happened several times, and I had these feelings when that would happen of just like, oh, because one patrol we set up, our team set up an observation post on a hill while there was quite a complex operation happening further down the hill, and we like to sit on high ground because we can see further. And basically the rule of thumb is that it is more beneficial to shoot downhill than uphill, because you are not fighting gravity. Gravity's aiding your bullets and your projectiles. You can also see more effectively because you have a higher viewpoint. And when we were up on that position with the higher viewpoint, the Taliban, and we were there for hours watching the more complex operation in the lower ground with the other teams that we were a part of. And the Taliban had seen where our team was, and they knew that basically in between our team and the base, that we would have to walk, logically, inevitably, we'd have to walk from the position on the hill back to where our base was. And it's simple, it makes sense. We can't just fly there, we have to walk there a particular way. And so, for example, the Taliban put a bomb in a haystack. because they can easily lift up the hay, put the bomb in, put the hay down, maybe it's a couple of minutes, and then it's done. And then they have methods to detonate the bomb. Some methods might have been using a kite string that could have been hundreds of meters long, and then they pull that, and then the bomb goes off. But they were quite clever with how they functioned it. So they would put, for example, a reference point behind the bomb. So there is maybe a tree, and they would see us from half a kilometer away, from behind a corner, walking in between the tree and the haystack, and they would pull the bomb. Because your eyes can play tricks, and there can be a bit of user error if you don't have a reference point. A reference point allowed the Taliban to kind of hone in on where exactly we were. And these are also techniques that we got taught within the military for identifying distances in the bush, or being able to communicate enemy positions based off reference points in the environment. So to expand a little bit, there is a lot of skills that soldiers develop. The crude idea is maybe that we just walk around with guns, and that is a part of what we do, but there is a lot of skill that makes a great soldier, and that is years of skill being put into the soldier, with decades and hundreds of years of lessons throughout warfare. So another example of these bombs being put out in front of us is we were in a team of 8 to 10 guys, and we left our base that was in Chora Valley, and we went and did, whatever it was, a 6-hour patrol. And we're walking through fields and over fences, and the fences are made from earth as well. And it's quite physically challenging terrain to be moving through, because it is so undulating. And then there is wet agricultural fields, and then fields of, from memory, barley or corn that we're moving through, and then aqueducts and rivers and orchards. There's a lot happening there at a lot of different levels. And there's also patches of just semi-wild trees or grasses. And when the agricultural area stops, it stops against the dasht, which is the equivalent to the desert there, but it's less like the desert in the Sahara. And maybe if I have a crude kind of explanation for it, imagine the Mongolian steppe meets the deserts of the Sahara, and it's something like this. So the earth is quite hard, it's very barren, there is a lot of stones there. There can also be really fine dust, and then there is this mountainscape of mountains that I believe are connected to this Hindu Kush mountain range, which goes all the way to Tibet, I think. But the mountains were incredibly powerful, and the landscape was very beautiful. Again, remembering it kind of looked like 200 AD, except for the motorbikes, the Toyota cars, AK-47s, and Nokia phones. Most of life was like 200 AD. And so this is where we were living. We would be patrolling out there in the day or the night, and quite, let's say, comfortable in that agricultural environment. And then we would come back to the base to live. And the base was, if you can imagine, these fortresses maybe you've seen in Europe, these castles, or even concepts like from Lord of the Rings, right? But the fortresses that we were staying in were made with Hessian walls, and the Hessian walls were structurally held by wire, and then there was rubble filled into that. So the wall might be 2 meters high, and then there is razor wire along the outside of it, and it is basically these earthen Hessian walls that could be a meter wide, but they're crude and effective. But it's like the modern equivalent to a castle, or these fortresses that the Romans built thousands of years ago. And we were out patrolling in the agricultural area, and we had come back. We were the only call sign out there. And when I say call sign, I mean we were the only Australian team, the only allied team, NATO team. which stands for Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was participating in the war on terror. We were the only team out there in that time frame, and we had just come back to the base, and there was a massive explosion, and that explosion was along the path that we crossed about an hour before, and that was kind of normal. And when that happens, maybe it was 800 meters away, a kilometer, I don't quite remember, but it was not so far back on our patrol route. When that happens, for me, I had this strange feeling, which is like a part of rejoice, and rejoice at the idea of maybe the Taliban bomb guy accidentally blew himself up. And then this sickening fear as like, well, I'm very happy that that didn't happen to us because it was very close to where we were. I'm very happy that that didn't detonate when we were out there, because that is catastrophic. Like these bombs are just so powerful, so catastrophic. But this was daily life. This was the environment that we would put ourselves in. So as I mentioned before, this very complex environment in regarding the human terrain, a counterinsurgency, where we don't know who is going to be shooting at us, and maybe we are talking to one person, and then 30 minutes later they've put a bomb, that same person has put a bomb in front of our path, and then we see them again 30 minutes later and they're saying hello to us. Or the actual complexity of the terrain, not to mention the like X factor that there is just bombs out there that have been left there since the Russians were there, and that was decades before we were there in 2010. So there was always just this random likelihood of getting blown up. And before we went to Afghanistan, our team received a brief from one of those men that sat on what we call a legacy mine. It's just left there. It's been there for decades, and he just accidentally sat on that, and his mate next to him sat on that, and his mate perished, and he lost his legs. So that was my workplace as a 23-year-old. And that was what my peers and I were going through in that phase of life as young men. And then just, that 2010 time frame, another patrol that we were on. So I'm going to step out of explaining things in a sequential time frame now and just sit into some of the really traumatic, heavy stuff that myself and the guys that I was in a team with experienced. And so we had known each other for years, mostly, and we had been on exercises with each other. We had slept next to each other in the bush. We watch over each other when we sleep. We go and stand next to each other in Afghanistan or patrol while we go to the toilet to protect each other. We make food for each other. It's very intimate environment in the sense of dependability, and the word camaraderie is maybe very hard to comprehend unless you have been through something similar to that. The cohesion that men get in experiences like that is so powerful, and camaraderie almost obliterates the word brotherhood, right? So we were certainly a very well-connected team. Even if we don't like people in the team, the level of professionalism might be like, hey, I don't like this guy or that guy, but I strive for honor, I strive for my values, and I will treat him as much as the team as anyone else. I'll protect him as much as anyone else. So we're definitely quite bonded on the depth of brotherhood. And we're going through a lot of shared experiences together, whether it was hardship in training in Australia, or it was the uncertainty and hardships which presented themselves in Afghanistan. We were in a badass area in this valley. That was our mentoring team's responsibility. And from memory, that place was called Mirrorways, but please don't quote me on the place names. And that was quite a Wild West place that had been getting a lot of hot action, and I was very excited to be out there with the opportunity to get blooded, to be in a high risk area where I had a higher likelihood of being able to kill Taliban. Like I said, maybe for the average person here, it just seems so foreign to be so passionate about killing an enemy, and that's just a part of the warrior psyche to what I experienced and what I understand. I wanted to kill Taliban, and most of my peers wanted to kill Taliban, and that's what we were there for, and that was a component of our mission. And a big part of the psyche. And that's approached as in a most professional way as possible, and it's a requirement of the profession. So we were on a night patrol in the badass area. I do think I got the place name wrong for the other base, but I'll just refer to the badass area as the badass area, because as you can imagine, there's different, like same in Australia, different cultures have different risk factors, different suburbs, different ethnicities, different crime rates, and not that the crime rate was so much of an issue. It was more like the Taliban influence in the areas and in the valley that our company was occupying. Different areas had fluctuating risks at different point in time, but this badass area was pretty much always a stronghold and high risk for Taliban activity, and they were quite powerful in that area. So we were out on a night patrol, and we had been patrolling, I think, pretty hard, and one of the psychological benefits of night patrol is how terrifying it is for Taliban, because they didn't have, most of them didn't ever have access to night vision goggles. We operated off that critical assumption that they couldn't see in the nighttime, but they hadn't had that technology. But I do have an understanding that in that theater of war, they had exposure to these different technologies at varying times, but the intelligence picture that we have when we're out operating is usually quite accurate. So our aim sometimes was to own the night, and in this badass area, it wasn't so heavy that we're focusing on owning the night, but it was our turn for a night patrol. Maybe just under 800 meters or under a kilometer into the night patrol, let's say 800 meters, we were walking through the dashed. And one of the reasons we went out into the dashed was because we can move more fast, and we have better visual observation on the area. There is still risks of these legacy mines or IEDs in the dashed, and so I never felt comfortable walking around there, but it was in some ways always juggling, well, what's the greatest risk at this mission at this point in time. But it was foreseen by our patrol commander that was the best way for us to get into the agricultural belt, which was where most of the fighting was, and it made sense. So 800 meters into this patrol in the dashed, I stepped off a small rise, maybe 2 inches deep in the earth, this kind of hard sand, and my heel stepped on a little rock and I rolled my ankle, and it was very hard to see effectively in anywhere with one green eye, and the other eye is basically fishing for ambient light, moonlight, starlight. It's very difficult to see in focus, and so I rolled my ankle and I tried to walk on it for another 20 meters, and then I just realized, shit, I can't go on with the patrol. And I spoke to the patrol commander and said, hey, I've really hurt my ankle. I can't put any weight on it. I don't think it's right for me to continue the patrol. We had a discussion, And then I turned back. They accompanied me maybe a couple hundred meters back, and then I hobbled my way in the nighttime back to the base. So maybe it was several hundred meters that I walked with myself, hobbled with myself, and I was quite scared. That was quite uncomfortable to be alone. But then also, like, if you can imagine where your mind can go being alone in a place like that, and just thinking about, what if I step on a mine by myself and then I'm in the darkness in the middle of nowhere, effectively, like, what's the consequence of that? I'm going to scream and die a terrible death on my own. That doesn't feel good. And then as I started to get closer to the base, there was this fear of, well, the Afghan army is on the perimeter of the base, and they had very different safety standards to what we were used to as Australians. Australians are quite, let's say, like, internationally competitive with our standard of soldiering. We're very, very good soldiers. And then to identify my risk that the Afghan might just get scared of me in the darkness and shoot at me, even though they know that I'm coming. They weren't reliable. Often it was sketchy. And so that was also us having a lot of this fear coming back to the patrol base at that moment, and that was quite unsettling. But that was a part of what the war was. So I strapped my ankle as best as I could, and I went out on another couple of patrols, and then I realized that my ankle wasn't getting better, and I was just verging into being a liability, a risk for the team. And I spoke to my boss and just told him, yeah, it's not getting better. It's been a week or however long it is, and I keep on exacerbating the injury. And so I think I should rest from patrolling for a bit. I didn't want to. As I said, I was quite hungry to be killing Taliban, and I also wanted to be patrolling as much as I could. I had the goal within my platoon to do the most patrols out of anyone in the platoon. So I would volunteer to do as many patrols as I could. So it was a bit of an ego blow to understand that I would be not patrolling for quite days or a couple of weeks until my ankle was better. So we went back to our main patrol base, which was, let's say, the size of a soccer field, something like that. And we had a couple of days rest as a team. And being in a war zone, it can be psychologically difficult. And so we look to celebrate experiences when they arise. One of the guys in the team had his 21st birthday, and that was a lad called Dale. And so we got together and he celebrated his 21st birthday. I think he got 2 beers or 1 beer, I don't remember, but we were, it's a big deal to turn 21 in the Australian culture. And then to turn 21 in Afghanistan at war, at a pretty rough part of it, was, good to celebrate. And after that, we just go back to our normal duties, and that might be like manning the tower, manning the radio, this kind of stuff that we do when we're at the patrol base. And the rest of the guys, the rest of the platoon, went out on patrol, and I stayed back with 5 or 6 other Australians at our section, and there were maybe 20 other Australians in the other section at this base. And I felt shame and guilt that I wasn't going on patrol with the lads, but I just had to accept that. So there was a small contingent of us back at base, and that just meant that we were manning the tower more. But life was in general quite slow. I had come down from maybe a sentry duty in the tower that day, and like I said, you can just imagine these medieval castles or castles like Lord of the Rings. We will have soldiers in a tower, and that soldier is looking out from the tower, keeping an eye on just how let's say, the energy feels from the village right next to where we live, because there's houses right next to our fortress. But that soldier is ready with usually a machine gun of a sort to be able to respond to any attack or pass on any relevant information. So I had come down from the tower, and one of the guys that I respected a lot. And I feel quite nervous and unsettled in this phase of what I'm saying. My body's actually shaking quite a bit now. And it's been a process for me over the years to take armor off, to release the numbness from my body that I protected myself from these uncomfortable emotions or other uncomfortable emotions in my life. But one of the soldiers that was, he's a champion, and I really looked up to him. And I invite you to understand or imagine that within the battlefield, within our team, within our mentoring team, which is maybe it was 180 guys, and a couple of girls there in specialty roles. But most of the men are guys, and the fighting men in harm's way is a deliberate combatant role were exclusively men at that point in time. But in the battle space, people's reputation, their stories spread. And just like the old days, right, where there would be champions of war or knights with real physical prowess, this guy, for me, was like the Achilles of our mentoring team, and I really respected him. He was just a badass war dog, just a courageous guy. And yeah, he was the Achilles of me, of our team. So I just really admired him. And from memory, his name is Brendan Clark. Clarky, I know, but I think his first name is Brendan, and he was awarded the Medal of Gallantry. I believe after the war, he was nominated for some of his fighting in the war, but just a serious champion. And and he came over to our side of the base, and our team on the base, we referred to our team as the Gypsies. We were like a platoon of infantry guys, and we operated with some cavalry and some engineers as well. And then there was the mentoring team guys on the same base, but just the other side, and they worked more with the Afghan National Army. But so Brendan Clark, and I think it was Little Johnsy. He's not little in size, but he had an older brother in the team, so we called him Little Johnsy, and it really is a family. Those guys were blood brothers, but then also there is this shared experience. And Little Johnsy took over on the tower because he was from the mentoring team, and it was just the gypsy guys that were there. It was 5 or 8 of us. Yeah, Clarky called us in, and I could feel something was up. And he got us in together, and he said, "There's been an incident. There's 2 Australian KIA from our team." And when he said that, like I just had this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. Just this sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and my throat was just clamped, and my face went hard. It was like I was putting on armor underneath my skin, just clenching my body. And he said the names that he heard on the radio was Thomas James Dale and Grant Kirby, and that was so confronting. That was just so confronting. He said words to the effect of, "We don't know fully what happened. There's been an IED blast." Yeah, that's kind of it. And what the fuck do you do after that? What do you do after that? Maybe that was 4 months into the tour. Other guys had died in other valleys, and that was really confronting. I didn't know them, but when Grant, Kirby, and Thomas Dale, when they died, that fucking, whoa, that rocked me. That rocked me so much. That really scared the fucking shit out of me. And that affected me so much, like, because it was 5 days before that. It was Dale's 21st birthday. A couple of days before that, I was on picket in the night with Grant Kirby, talking about his daughters at home, talking about the school they go to. And then in an instant, those guys are blown to smithereens, wiped off the planet. And then the rest of the team is and I find this out afterwards, right? And this is fucking graphic. So please make a conscious choice if you want to exit this now. But the rest of the team had the job of picking up their entrails, picking up their skin, and putting it into bags. One of the ribs of the guys was blown into another one of the vehicles in the back of the vehicle, and they found it 2 days later. One of the necklaces, I think Kirby's necklace, had Mary on it. It was blown off and landed on top of a vehicle. So my mates had the job of just going over this hill and sifting to get as much of the body parts as they could of my mates into fucking bags. Oof. I didn't find out this until afterwards. It's not something that gets spoken about on the radio. Not that level of detail at all. And most guys didn't want to talk about it. It's fucking terrifying. It's catastrophic. It's sickening. That's what happened. And I think it rocked everyone. I'm really fortunate that I wasn't there for that. I had survivor's guilt for a long time around not being there for that. And it also brought up a lot of my own fears, like, well, what if I was there, and what if I was on the bomb? To paint a picture, the vehicles had stopped on top of a small hill, and there were several vehicles around in a circle. And when we do that, things are usually quite safe, and we're maybe several 100 meters away from the agricultural belt, which is where the Taliban usually shoot from. And we're that far away because of understanding the weapons that they use. They can't shoot further than that. So we usually position ourselves just on the edge of where they can shoot, but where we can shoot back with our heavier weapons. And so the vehicles had circled up on that small hill, and they were doing push-ups and heaves, and one of them stopped on this mine and blew them both to smithereens. And one of my mates was so close to the blast, it's just missed his head, but then crushed the windows of the vehicle behind him. Another one of my mates had bone fragment from one of the deceased get lodged in his face. Like, I just can't describe these stories that I had shared to me in any adequate detail, and I don't know how well the guys that were there could talk about that either now or then. I can't convey how fucking ghastly that was to be a part of, even to not be there. To not be there. Oh. So there is the business end of managing KIA, friendly KIA, and that what happened was we had basically two specialists that handle this stuff from the headquarters, flew out to our base, and they asked for volunteers, or it was suggested by the team leader that was with us, that myself and another one of my friends, I think I volunteered anyway, myself and another one of my friends pack up the bed and the personal belongings of Dale and Kirby. And that was a fucking harrowing process. Like, can you imagine the events I've spoken to you about so far in this podcast, being in a very deeply connected team, and a sense of camaraderie that is very hard to comprehend, and then this cat and mice games of war and the complexities of counterinsurgency warfare, and having so many close calls with bombs that we'd had, or small arms fire, bullets, rocket-propelled grenades, all these close calls that we'd had. And then two guys within our platoon getting obliterated by a bomb at once in a place that was meant to be safe, or safe, cleared by the engineers, and it's certainly no fault of the engineers. I have nothing but respect and trust for their ability. It's just the nature of war. And then like packing up my mate's stuff, packing up his socks, packing up his journal, going through, we were going through their stuff, because a part of the protocol is to just check that they don't have ammunition in their equipment. There's nothing like that there, because that trunk is going to get sent home to their mother and their father. So we're going through that to make sure that there's nothing there that shouldn't get sent back. But then also just this feeling of fucking emptiness and fear, and my own mortality. Like, am I going to see my kids again? Oh, will I make it back to Australia? And this is the first time I've spoken about this, other than maybe to one psychologist once, like, or a couple of friends. I touched a little bit on it, but to sit in my emotions of this is, I'm having the space in my life to do that now, and I'm able to regulate my nervous system now, to be able to be in this and to not put on a mask and to not kind of like squeeze my emotions or squeeze the tension in my body so I don't feel the pain here. But that was so scary, and it was so confronting, so traumatic. But we packed up the guy's stuff, and then I sent their trunks and their equipment back with these specialists from the headquarters to manage the chaperoning and the logistics of expatriating the bodies back to Australia. And we went to the main base at Tarin Kowt, and I had the honour of being a part of the team to escort their coffins onto the Hercules. So that was a couple of days of rehearsing, and the whole base, which is like thousands of people. I don't know how many, but it was a big base, like I said, at Tarin Kowt, this 2-kilometre base, whatever it was. A lot of people, everyone comes out to pay their respects, whether they're Dutch or German or New Zealand or whatever. Like, everyone that's there comes out to honour the fallen, because there's all this within us, there's all this deep understanding that that's a consequence of being there, and a consequence of the contribution to the war on terror. And it's a really powerful point for reflection and honour when that happens. So we escorted the coffins through the base to the Hercules, and they got put on the Hercules, and they had the Australian flag on them. And again, I just didn't know how to fucking talk. I didn't know how to talk. My throat was so tight with fear and choking in my emotions, and all I knew how to do to manage that was to just create as much numbness in my body as I could. But as you can hear in my voice, it's something that deeply affected me, and I still have some of that experience in my body now. And I know the body doesn't forget. The body remembers everything. It's a subconscious level of retainment of information. And I've had an awareness for the years of, like, Anzac Day, which is when we celebrate in Australia, and we acknowledge the sacrifice of servicemen, both like current veterans, but more so starting from the conflict in World War One and the continuing conflicts. We pay respect to that. Anzac Day is hard for me. I haven't had one for years because I've been living in the Arctic, but I can really feel like the tension in my body, the loss of the sacrifice of the men that I knew personally and the men that I knew by extension within our battle group, within our task force. But I also know that opening this stuff up for me within, like I said, a fluorescent room with a psychologist for a 60-minute appointment, that's never going to fucking work. And I can understand why it doesn't work, and I can understand why guys don't go near that. Maybe there is other treatments. I've heard some people talk positively about not just talk therapy, but other therapies to access trauma in the brain. But I really, for me, trust now in my experiences with ayahuasca and when it's right for me to go to her again, I will go. And I also trust that she will know when it's right to bring up like the full fear in my body from these traumatic experiences from Afghanistan, that she will help me through that. And if you don't know so much about what ayahuasca is, I will talk about that more in other podcasts, and I've made reference to it in my first podcast. Ayahuasca has been a very powerful indigenous traditional medicine for me, and I place more faith in her than now for my healing journey. I would say that the clinical treatments prevented me from killing myself. They helped me survive, but the actual shedding of trauma and opening of my heart and releasing of things like control and fear and judgment, and living behind deep trauma as a daily life, really shedding that stuff has been mostly to do with massive life changes for me and with men's work as well, but also with psilocybin therapy in the Netherlands and with my journey with ayahuasca in these indigenous contexts. So I do want to say, like, to my brothers that were in that experience, I really salute your courage for being able to tend as best as you can to collecting your mates, gathering up the remnants of Grant Kirby and Thomas Dale, and for persevering on through that. I also know that they were fucking ambushed the day after. They were fucking ambushed. And then it was a complex ambush. So that vehicle convoy got ambushed the day after this explosion, or the second day after. And then there was small arms fire, I think. It was fucking intense. Like, those guys, I don't know how I'd be mentally if I went through that. I know a lot of guys have struggled, and I also know a lot of guys have got like Pandora's box with this stuff kind of buried, or maybe it's a bit more like this Jumanji box, like it's still there. Guys know it's there within themselves, but it's buried and it's away, and it's kept away with being busy or with fucking having a family or alcohol or whatever, or Valium. But I think everyone's just doing their best. But I'm really fortunate that I wasn't there to witness and experience that in person. It was certainly impacting enough for me to just be a part of the wider team, and then to, like I said, pack up the bed space, fucking putting the socks and underwear and his journal and his family photos into the trunk to send it back, and then escorting their coffin onto the plane. Oof. And how do I digest that, right? So I also want to acknowledge how that was for my family. So my first wife, the mother of my first children, she saw on the news that my valley, that 2 Australians had been killed in my valley, and she knew that it was on the news before she was told, so it wasn't me. But she knew it was a part of this team of 180 guys. For like, very likely it's a part of this 180 guy team. She didn't know it was a part of this smaller team, this platoon that I was in. But when I called her, like, fuck, I was so distraught. And I really salute her for just doing her best and for just fucking picking up the phone. She picked up the phone. And I couldn't talk. She knew when a phone call came from a private number that it was probably going to be me in Afghanistan. I just couldn't talk. I was too afraid of crying. There were other guys in the room that were calling home as well, and everyone was pretty affected by this, as you can imagine. Like, there were a lot of maybe, let's say, spirits broken or people on the edge, and I just called her Kate. God bless her. Thanks, Kate. Thanks for doing your best. And I just couldn't talk. I just held the phone there maybe for a minute. Then I made a noise, and she knew I was there, but she just stayed on the phone. And I also wonder how it was for my wife and my kids, and for my parents, that their son was in war, and at a place and time of war that was very serious, and there was that wasn't the first deaths of the trip, and it wasn't the last deaths of the trip for the task force. Then we had the experience of, for me, like the first patrol after that. I felt so shit scared. I felt so fucking scared in my stomach. And because it was this realization of like I said, guys in other valleys had died, and that's confronting. But I was still enjoying the thrill of being shot at or shot near or having bombs go off. And then when I had my mates die, and I'm faced with the reality of escorting their coffins to the Hercules to fly back to Australia, then I was just like, fuck, it is all fun and games until someone gets hurt. And I was fucking scared. If I thought I was scared before, I was scared after. And that's also part of the mark of a warrior, is to be so shit scared and still show up and still face that fear and to still go out. I will stipulate, though, that there were some guys, for example, from my understanding, that went on their leave after 4 months. They had, like, we got a two-week break in between our operation. And some guys, I think, didn't come back from that. And I can fully understand that. I can fucking fully understand why it was too much or whatever was happening for you. I can really understand that. I kept on going though, but I didn't look at dirt the same for years. Even coming back to Australia, I would look at dirt and I would just be fixated by it. I'd be stressed by dirt. I would really like inquire at the dirt. Think, when was that dirt disturbed? When did someone dig that? Is that an animal that's moved that dirt, or is that a human? It really affected me. I also didn't know how to talk about it amongst the team. I didn't know how to talk about the fears that I had. Some guys were crying in the night. Some guys were crying on their phone to their missus. I think we all just did our best to try as much as we could to tuck it away, but it certainly affected all of us in different ways. But that's certainly one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, and it was this it's a complex situation for me with survivor's guilt by not being there. With I didn't have to witness it. I witnessed peripheral things. Like I said, we're a very close-knit team, and I didn't have to witness that, but it still severely affected me, which I judged myself for years. I judged myself for how much it affected me. I told myself I didn't deserve to consider that a personal trauma. Like, how fucking stupid is that? How self-critical is that, right? I told myself I didn't deserve PTSD for years. I just judged myself for being a coward and a weakling for having that stuff affect me. Fuck. Oof. Oof. But I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to just be with my body a bit after sharing that. But there's a lot more in the Afghan files, and I'll get back to it when I soon. Oh, all right, I'm back. A bit of a change in pace, although that still affects me talking about that. I can really feel it. It's fucking intense as well. But to it's hard to paint a picture actually of how spectacularly beautiful the landscape that where we were in Afghanistan was, or maybe is. I don't know how it is now, but the natural landscape was incredibly beautiful. And like I said, these really powerful mountains going really up into the sky, and these vibrant green agricultural belts, these fields, these orchards, even because we spent a lot of time, can imagine, over an 8 month deployment, we sat a lot of time in these green belts, and that was where most of the population spent their time as well. It's where they lived. But we had a lot of time trying to be invisible to a certain degree, as much as we could in that space. And so that means like walking around generally quite slowly, very in our senses as a team, because security was really, we needed to be so aware of our environment in order to stay secure within our team, to stay strong from any threats that presented themselves. So that meant that we're effectively looking in all directions at any given point in time, and we are talking in low voices mostly, but to actually be able to witness some of the beauty of that place was, well, I'm very fortunate to have been there, but I remember some things, right? Like just seeing the way that the sunlight was reflecting through the wheatgrass seeds or the barley and the apricot orchards. It was like this scene in Gladiator when the main character is at his farm in Spain, like just a lot of natural beauty and this turning back the clock in time in so many ways. To be completely honest and speak from my truth right now where I'm at, I feel quite done with this episode. Maybe you can understand. Maybe you can understand why. I'm certainly not finished with the Afghan files, Pandora's box. There is actually a lot more to talk about. So if you haven't already, please subscribe. And I do, as I sit now, have the intention to communicate an Afghan files 2.0 Pandora's box to be continued. That's it from me. Back to you in the studio. Oof.